Because the idea that reading is some sort of all-purpose skill is the current accepted view, and it's also the view that turns out to be incorrect. Cognitive science is very clear that reading is not an all-purpose skill. It's a very much what the technical people call a domain-specific skill. So if you knew something about cricket, you can read a passage about cricket. If you don't, you can't. If you read a passage about bridges and building bridges and you know something about engineering, you can read the passage. If you don't know that material, you can't. The idea that you reach a certain general ability to read is a convenient generalization, but in detail it's an inaccurate point. That reading is very variable, very domain specific, and it turns out that to be a good reader in a particular society, a particular language community at a given time, requires a kind of definable general knowledge. And the reason it's definable is very interesting intellectually. It's because when a person is writing for a general audience in the United States, that person has to know what the audience can be taken for granted to already know. If you have to explain every step of the way, you never finish your explanation. So in order to communicate effectively, you have to assume your audience knows certain things. Now, those certain things that a literate person, a writer, assumes that other literate people know, that's the knowledge the schools have an obligation to teach, because then everybody can be in them.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about your experience teaching core knowledge versus your experiences in other schools.
Okay.
How is this approach different from, let's say, a more typical public school in Pittsburgh?
Okay, so a more typical public school, there's just a few topics that they choose to cover, and teachers kind of spend however much time on them. A perfect example that I hear a lot is there was a time where teachers just picked, what do you want to teach? So you had like 7-week units on dinosaurs or what have you. So I know now it's a little bit more focused in other schools, but they really keep those concepts very broad. So the American Revolution for most kids in Pittsburgh is not taught until 4th or 5th grade, and in some cases middle school, high school. So at that point, if you have a kid who is kind of zoning out at that point, they don't really get it. Where with core knowledge, even though you're not giving them the super duper in-depth information, they still have a basic concept of what it was about. So they hear about it in 1st grade. They hear about it a couple more times in elementary school, so that when they get to 7th grade and they're learning about that concept, they remember certain key facts. And I've actually had parents who come to me and they're a little bit worried because their child does not know every single fact about the concepts that we're teaching. And I tell them the cool thing about core knowledge is it's not about do you have an A, B, or C. It's about if someone says ancient Egypt, you don't think that that's a TV show or a cool book on the shelf. You know that there's something about that, it's a real thing. So where a lot of people say, I have an issue with Mesopotamia and that it's too hard for these kids to grasp at such a young age. Again, I don't expect you to know every single thing about Mesopotamia, but I expect you to know these are the basic facts about it. And I expect you that as you move on in grades, that you continue building a little bit more on it, building a little bit more, building a little bit more, so that by the time you're in college and you're taking a Mesopotamian class in history, you really have that essential background knowledge to be successful.
At the time, Pierre Hinton, that was his name, came to the school,
And he recognized me, but didn't initially have a conversation with me because we were going to go into classrooms. And there were a team of 15 people from the state and the school and the district going into the classrooms. We went into a first grade classroom, and the children had been discussing the presidents. And he was standing there, not necessarily buying into it, that this was concrete knowledge that the children had, but rather rote memorization. And all of a sudden, one little girl, posed a question to all the adults in the room as to what presidents were on coins and what presidents were on dollar bills. And all of a sudden, all the adults looked at each other because they weren't quite sure. But Mr. Hinton especially reached into his pocket to take out coins to see if, in fact, the child was correct. And when he realized that she was correct, he turned around and he says to me, "You were right and I was wrong." And it proved to him that day that content knowledge was the pivotal turning point for children. And also that as adults, we had ceased to constantly become our own ongoing learners.
As it happens in the charter world, that has also shown its merit, where these charter systems that have multiple schools are all reinforcing their teacher training and so on with a common curriculum, and also enabling the teachers themselves to learn from each other on a wide basis. It expands the sort of in-service training possibilities tremendously.
If a whole district does it, it not only improves all of the schools within the district, it improves the high school, because if this is a K-8 program for knowledge, our high school programs are failing, which means there's more remediation programs in the colleges. But even looking further, it changes communities. It's that entrance, and it's the difference between success and failure. It's the difference between no opportunity and opportunity. So if you have a whole district, as in New York City, my district was the largest district in the city, and they had 54 schools. Think of the impact of 54 schools. And not only that, the teacher professional development. If you have 100 teachers doing professional development, and then you have 700 or 800 or 1,000 coming to the table with all different expertise and all different planning, and what goes into creating the domain units and the knowledge base that everybody needs, then you become your own university of learners, and that's pivotal. At the beginning of this transformation, that first summer, not all of the teachers were on board because it was a rigorous learning curve that all of the teachers were going to have to embrace. And there was one specific teacher, Mr. Douglas Dillon. He was a phenomenal teacher, especially in world and American history and in literature. And he became the constant naysayer that this was impossible for all of us to embrace this kind of knowledge. And be able to turnkey it to children and in our practice. So throughout the year, when he saw the tide was changing and so many teachers that originally were the outliers were now coming along, he didn't want to be an outlier anymore. And he had always taught a program called The Great Thinkers, where he would discuss Aristotle with the children and Socrates and Plato, and he would align it to modern day thinkers. And the transformation that really turned the whole school around was that he decided 3 months into our endeavor that this was a worthwhile. And where had it been? Because he had already been teaching for 30 years. Why was this just newly discovered, and why weren't we teaching more in-depth content?
Contrast between the UVA students and the Richmond Community College students. Clearly the difference was one of background knowledge that they had, which enabled them to understand the various texts they were presented. A little bit of knowledge in one case, skills, the basic skills just as high with the community college students. What was lacking was the knowledge. But that knowledge turned out to be critical to their futures. They wouldn't have been able to get into UVA to start with because the scores you make, for example, on the SAT test, will be determined by your vocabulary. There'll be a relationship between your vocabulary and your general knowledge. You just simply don't have the competence as students or as readers, and therefore you're not being given an equal chance in life.